Paul Jouve was born in 1878 in Bourg-en-Malot, in the Seine-et-Marne region of France. His father, Auguste Jouve, was a successful impressionist painter, ceramic designer and photographer. In 1880, when Paul was 2 years old, the family relocated to Paris, and in his teens he enrolled in the city's École des Beaux-Arts, but he left after only a year. Subsequently, he took occasional drawing lessons but was mostly self-taught. He had long been obsessed with drawing animals and was frequently to be found drawing from observation at the Museum of Natural History. He also spent a lot of time learning from the lithographer Henri Patrice Dion, a friend of his father. Astonishingly, Jouve was still only 16 years old when he exhibited for the first time at the Salon of the Society of French Artists in 1894. And before the year was out, he was already selling lithographs to collectors. He continued to have some success as his career as an artist developed, but in 1898 he was obliged to complete his compulsory military service, which created an unwelcome 2-year hiatus in his ambitions. But in 1900, when Paris held its Exposition Universelle, the architect René Binet commissioned him to design a number of animal images for a frieze 100 metres long, which were then produced by the ceramic artist Alexandre Bigot. To date, Jouve had worked exclusively as an artist, but in 1901, the satirical Parisian magazine L'Assiette au Beurre devoted an entire issue to his illustrations, collectively titled Social Revenge. These images use the tried and tested technique of depicting anthropomorphic animals, in this instance apes, to satirise and condemn human folly from any number of angles. But although the images were remarkably compelling and very successful in their satirical mission, this was the only occasion that he created such socially aware drawings, and having completed the assignment, he returned immediately to his art. At this time his work came to the attention of Samuel Bing, the owner of a respected gallery in the centre of Paris. He was impressed enough to offer Jouve his support, paid for the artist's trips to various European zoos to conduct the necessary drone and photographic research, and provided him with the space to exhibit his various creative endeavours. By now Jouve was enjoying significant success with his art, with apparently little or no intention of pursuing illustration at all. In 1905, Marcel Bing, Samuel's son and business partner, organised Jouve's first significant one-man show in his new Parisian gallery. In 1907 he travelled to Algeria, and in addition to the creation of a large volume of drawings and paintings of the region and its people, he also met his future wife Annette Noiret. On his return to Paris he sold many of these images as prints and paintings to eager collectors, and had several well-attended exhibitions. In 1911 he moved into a large studio in central Paris, which would be his base of operations for the rest of his career. But Jouve's burgeoning success was inevitably curtailed when France declared war on Germany in 1914. Although already 36 years old, he joined the army and was dispatched to northern France to fight in the trenches. But mercifully, a year later he was transferred to Greece, where he was seconded to a military photographic unit, and while stationed there he met Prince Alexander of Serbia, who admired his work greatly and became one of his keenest patrons. Although he had actually begun work on a commission to illustrate an edition of Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book some years earlier, the war had forced it to be put on hold, and consequently it wasn't until 1919 that it was actually published. It was an immediate and unprecedented success, with a collection of stunning images of varying complexity and stylistic approaches. There were formally designed pages with small-framed graphically stylised images and decorations, as well as a series of character studies which were rendered using fine line work as the basis, with subtle colour washes applied on top. I confess I really don't know for certain, and none of the sources I found want to tell me precisely how Jouve made these remarkably distinctive images. But many display the graphic qualities associated with etching, and it is known that this was a favoured process. but others looked more like they were created with traditional lithography drawn onto polished stone, with a decided textural look to the render. And of course he was well known and admired for his facility with that process too. But whatever his methods were, the images he created for this, only his second illustrated project, were uniformly mesmerising and aesthetically considered depictions of the various animal characters. There were also a few images within the collection which also featured Mowgli and a couple of other more incidental human characters, but it was obvious that it was the animals themselves Jouve had most interest in. In 1921 his first marriage ended in divorce, which was followed quickly by his second marriage to Marguerite Jean Macaron. In 1922, among other diverse achievements, he designed this impressive needlepoint rug, and in that same year Jouve and his new wife sailed from Marseille to the Far East, a trip which encompassed Indochina, Ceylon, China and finally India. Of course he created copious drawings and took photographs of the many sights they encountered, and on his return to his studio he created prints and paintings, and their exoticism and aesthetic qualities proved to be a magnetic draw for many of his patrons. But however well things were going for him professionally, it wasn't much later that his second wife left, taking their newborn son with her, and he found himself divorced for the second time. I could find no record of a third attempt, so he may well have given up on the idea entirely. But despite his domestic troubles, his career never faltered, and throughout the 1920s he continued to exhibit and sell his work to eager collectors. He spent some of the considerable income his work had by now brought him on having a large house built near Aix-en-Provence. And in 1929, a decade after his success with the Jungle Book, he returned to illustration with the publication of the Fable de La Fontaine, the French rhyming version of Aesop's originals. And although this project provided Jouve with the opportunity to create more characterful animals, he completely ignored any notions of making his subjects anthropomorphic, as so many others had done. And although there was the faintest suggestion in a couple of images at least that the creatures were conversing, they were very much as nature made them, and few if any concessions were made to the narrative nature of the writing. As he had done with the earlier Jungle Book, Jouve varied his stylistic approach from quite flat and graphic through to more complex expressionistic renders. And in this instance he seems to have varied his use and combination of medium and techniques even more than before. Only a year later he followed this with another two books, the first of which was Cars Hunting by Rudyard Kipling, a short story featuring the python character from the Jungle Book. And this narrative also provided Jouve with more opportunities for the inclusion of other animals and Mowgli from the original tale. I don't have actual verification that his illustrated books were published as limited edition collector's items, but I would seriously doubt that such expensively bound and printed productions were intended for mainstream publication. It was also in 1930 he published Pierre Loti's A Pilgrim from Angkor, and it was with the publication of this book that many of the drawings he created during his trip there some 8 years earlier now made an appearance. There was some figure work and of course the expected depictions of animal life, but unusually it was the more scenic illustrations which dominated the book, and they provided the reader with some breathtaking and vivid graphic impressions of the monuments and sights to be found in this not often seen exotic location. All this book illustration was in addition to his ongoing torrent of animal prints, paintings and sculpture, but somehow in 1931 he managed to find the time and creative energy to illustrate Leconte de Lisle's poem Barbare, with a collection of compelling spot illustrations in monochrome and duotone. And although it wasn't only the big cat predators who were the subject of these verses, they certainly dominated the book, and Jouve responded to this commission with a collection of staunchly unsentimental muscular studies. It was also in 1931 that he embarked on another trip to North Africa, where he spent several months with the nomadic Tuareg people who inhabited the region. And of course he made many drawings which in this instance were far more driven by the human presence than usual. They subsequently sold well as prints and paintings alongside his ongoing output of more animal-themed work, which increasingly revealed his fascination for portrayals of predatory animals and birds. Earthly Paradise by Sidonie Gabrielle Colette was a collection of the author's writings on the wonders and beauty of the animal kingdom, which was published in 1932, and another ideal vehicle for Jouve's expressive visual talents. And the various line and colour wash illustrations he created for the book made for a totally absorbing blend of text and imagery, which unusually for Jouve at this time featured what might be called the softer side of the natural world, with a conspicuously lighter touch in their evocation. In 1934 he also illustrated the book of animals we call Wild by André de Maison, with a series of monochrome lithographic scenes of animals in their natural habitats. And again the images he produced favoured the predators, although not exclusively so. It's recorded that in the later 1930s Jouve was also occupied with the creation of murals for the ocean liner Normandy and the Luxembourg Pavilion at 1937's Arts Exposition. I found no evidence of either, but I did find this monumental sculpture situated in Paris's Trocadero Gardens, created in that year. It was also in 1937 he returned to illustration with the Book of the Brush and French Equatorial Africa, both of which were written by René Marin, and both yielded quite a few renditions of the animals to be found in these regions. Following this assignment, it appears Jouve was concentrating far more on his paintings and prints, and this continued to be the case throughout the Second World War and the German occupation of France, although his previously relentless productivity was much reduced. When France was liberated in 1944, his artistic output resumed with renewed vigour, but it was 1948 before he returned to illustration, with an edition of Honoré de Balzac's 1830 novel A Passion in the Desert. For this project, Jouve created a collection of engrossing atmospheric lithographs, some of which were scenic double-page images. And there were also more expected images of animals both in the wild and in captivity. But for reasons known only to Jouve, he opted to render his human characters with a certain stiffness of posing and execution, unlike the more naturalistic figure work he was manifestly capable of. With this project behind him, it was renditions of wildlife, executed in all manner of mediums and type of print, that occupied Jouve for the next several years. It wasn't until 1956 that the book simply titled The Hunt was also published, and being without a narrative thread or human presence, Jouve was free to create more of the animal studies which constituted the dominant driving force of his output in both art and illustration. Despite by now being 78 years old, he continued to travel and make drawings, and it was also in that year he journeyed to Bermuda, where he created a series of vibrant colour images of coral fish from study in the aquarium there. They were expressionistically rendered in a mix of oil paint and charcoal, and were uniformly compelling studies of marine life. And he even designed this decorative screen, presumably as a private commission, based on his sketched observations. 1958 saw the publication of the medieval story of Renard the Fox, rewritten by Maurice Genevoix, and for what may well have been only the second time in his career, the first being his satires for L'Assiette au Beurre half a century earlier, Jouve did actually create some anthropomorphic animal characters. Having said that, his only real concession was to dress some of the creatures in clothes and pose them like humans. And he obviously drew the line at the idea of imbuing them with human emotions or facial expressions. Nevertheless, the resulting images were suitably absorbing and more than usually reflective of the darker true nature of this centuries-old narrative. Another 5-year period spent entirely in the production of art ended in 1963 with a collection of what for Jouve were fairly casual rendered coloured images of wild animals for My Great Hunts in Central Africa, written by Edouard Foer. And in 1967 his last illustrated commission, Jules Verne's 5 Weeks in a Balloon, was published, with equally disengaged colour wash images. But following this less than triumphant publication, Jouve carried on creating paintings and prints of his favourite wildlife subjects up to his death in 1973 at the age of 95. More than most of the subjects who have appeared in this series, Paul Jouve represents a visually creative individual who straddled the worlds of art and illustration and used both as highly successful outlets for his formidable talents. Arguably, he was actually more an artist than an illustrator, if judged by the volume of each he created during his long life and career. And in most cases, the only real difference between the two is that the illustrated works were created for a specific commercial outcome. And I will, as usual, end with a short compilation of more that I couldn't fit into the main body of the video.